Ralph Ellis, welcome back to the program.
Thanks very much for having me on, Russell. Good to hear from you again.
Ralph Ellis has been researching biblical and Egyptian history for more than 30 years. Ralph Ellis is the author of 11 or 12 books, although we're not quite sure. Being independent from theological and educational establishments allows Ralph to tread where others do not dare. And it is through this independence that Ralph has discovered so many new biblical and historical truths. In today's conversation, Ralph and I will discuss the true origins of King Solomon. To learn more about Ralph Ellis, visit edfu-books.com, edfu-books.com. Ralph, according to the Bible, King Solomon was the wealthy and wise king of Israel, the son of David, said to have reigned from 970 to 931 BC. Solomon had 700 wives, 300 concubines, hoarded his wealth, engaged in idolatry. He had a child with the Queen of Sheba. All of this angered God, who then punished him by removing 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel from the Israelites. That's the Wikipedia version. You have a slightly different interpretation.
Yeah, as always, yes. I always have a different interpretation. Well,
was King Solomon even a real person?
Oh, yes. I think he was a real person, but as per usual, they've lost him, which is the standard refrain from all of our talks we've done before on all of these biblical characters. They're very forgetful, these Israelites and these Jews. They keep losing all of their characters. How do they manage to do that? Well, again, I think it has been deliberate because they don't want to recognize the truth of their ancestry, of their heritage. And that heritage, as we've seen before with the Jesus talk and everything else, is from Egypt. That's where the Israelites came from. So in being sort of so forgetful, and, well, I don't think it's forgetful necessarily. I think they've deliberately amended some of their texts. They've lost Solomon and David. Now, how have they managed to do that? Because according to the biblical text, as you said in your intro there, David and Solomon were the richest monarchs, the most famous monarchs, the most influential monarchs of that era. We're talking, 10th century BC here. So within the historical record, these two monarchs just do not exist. There's a lot of archaeology being done around Jerusalem in Judea by very, very competent archaeologists like Finkelstein and Silberman. And they've been around and they've excavated and they cannot find the united monarchy. According to these archaeologists, they say that Jerusalem was no more than a village in the 10th century. So the united monarchy doesn't exist. It's just not in the historical record, not in the archaeological record. So what can we do about this? The Old Testament says they were famous, influential, very wealthy, had all of this infrastructure and all of this army and everything else. And the archaeology says, not there. So again, we come back to our two options. Either this is all mythological, and a lot of people, the minimalists, I think they like to call themselves, take this view that it's all mythological. These people didn't exist because we can't find them in the historical record. Therefore, it's all a myth. And of course, the maximalists, the literalists, will say, of course, they existed because they're in the Old Testament. Well, the only other options we've got is that we're either looking in the wrong location or the wrong era. In the case of the Jesus story, I think we've discussed that quite a lot previously. We were looking mostly in the wrong era, and that's why we couldn't find the Jesus character. We had to go looking 40 years later to find the Jesus character. In this case, I think the chronology is correct, exactly correct, but we're looking in the wrong location, and that's why we can't find the city of Jerusalem, as it were, and King David and King Solomon. We're looking in the wrong location. But again, I think this is a very minimalist cover-up because these texts were supposed to be sacred. You're not supposed to go and change them. So there's really just a slight misinterpretation that's been put upon these texts. I don't think the capital city of the United Monarchy was in Zion. I think it was in Zoan. Same word pretty much in the Hebrew. Of course, Hebrew has no vowels. It's the same word. So where is Zoan? Well, Zoan is in Tanis. It's in Egypt. It's in the Nile Delta. It's right up sort of by the Mediterranean. It's quite close to the Mediterranean. A very famous city, actually, called Tanis. In fact, after I wrote all this book, this comes from my book, Solomon, Pharaoh of Egypt. And after I'd written it, someone said, did you realize that's where they filmed Raiders of the Lost Ark or something? One of those films. So anyway, the capital city of David and Solomon, in my view, is Tanis in Egypt. And that's why they can't find any evidence over in Jerusalem. So why do I think it was Tanis? Well, first of all, I didn't believe that you could lose these two monarchs. I didn't believe that you could lose them in the archaeological record, and I wasn't quite sure that this story was completely fabricated, that it was mythical. So there had to be a resolution for this. So I went looking for these two monarchs, and it seemed to me that you're not going to find their names because obviously people would have been looking for their names for the last 1,000 years or more. So I went looking for their attributes, first of all. So what is King David known for? Well, he's known for the Star of David and the City of David. So the first thing I went looking for is a king who is known for his star and his city. And as it happens, if you go into the 21st dynasty of Egypt, which is exactly the same era as the United Monarchy, we come across a pharaoh called Susens. But of course, that's a Greek rendering, so that really doesn't help us very much. We really want his Egyptian name. And his Egyptian name is Pasibakahayonet. And Pasibakahayonet means my star rises in my city. And it's spelt, if you look at the hieroglyphs, it's spelt with the city hieroglyph and the star hieroglyph. So here is a monarch who is known within his So here is a monarch who from his very hieroglyphs is known for the city and the star, the city of David and the Star of David. And that was my starting point for this. And I just had a feeling at that point that I was onto something, because here is a monarch, same era, almost the same region, just down the road from Judea, of course, with the same attributes as the very famous King David. And of course, this was a very wealthy monarch, just as King David was reputed to have been. This was the new 21st dynasty of Egypt. Egypt was divided again at this time, as it had been before, during the Akhenaten era and also during the Hyksos era, which we talked about before. Egypt was divided, so there was a new dynasty that was establishing itself in the north of Egypt, in the Nile Delta, and this was the 21st dynasty. Started with Smendes back in about 1077, I think they say normally, BC. So in the 11th century. And then very shortly afterwards, we came down to a first Susens and then a second Susens. So there were two pharaohs by this name. And the second pharaoh by this name was at exactly the same, he lived at exactly the same time as King David. I did an analysis actually of all of the pharaohs of this dynasty, and of course these dynasties are not cast in stone. The whole of this dynasty was put together by looking at the scribblings on mummy wrappings. And so you get all these mummy wrappings from this era, and they obviously mention the king. And then you've got to try and they mention the year of the king. And from these mummy wrappings, because they don't give a date, you've got to juggle them all together and try and make a cohesive chronology from these mummy wrappings. And when I put them all together, the first Susens disappeared from the record. And the only Susens, the only star and city pharaoh, was the second one, Susens II, who reigned from about 970 BC, same time as King David. So that was the basis upon which I started this investigation. But if this is going to be true, if this is the united monarchy of David and Solomon, then everything about this royal dynasty would have to be the same. And that's, that's stretching credibility a little bit. You're going to have the whole of a Egyptian dynasty to be the same as the Jewish dynasty, the Israelite dynasty. It seems to be stretching the possibilities somewhat. But as I looked into it, all of the history started dropping out of the historical record, as it were. So the first thing I looked at was the ancestors of King David. And there is an ancestor of King David, just going back 5 generations, I suppose, who's called Ram, who I linked up with Ramesses, who would be the last pharaoh of the previous dynasty, the 20th dynasty. And then we come to another of the biblical patriarchs who was called Aminadab. Now, the second pharaoh of the 21st dynasty was called Amenazbanebjet. Amenazbanebjet. Essentially, that's the same name. All they've done is they've left out 2 of the central syllables from this name, and the name is almost identical. And then we have another character from the Bible who's called Neshon. And the equivalent pharaoh from the 21st dynasty will be Amenem-Neshu. Neshu, sounds the same to me. And then we have Salmon, who's the great-grandfather of David, I think he was. And the equivalent in the historical record is Siamon. Salmon, Siamon. And then we have Boaz. He's the famous one from Masonic tradition, of course. Boaz was one of the pillars of the Temple of Jerusalem. But in the Egyptian record, we have Bas-Uas-Orkon. Boaz, Basuaz. It looks like we've got ourselves an Egyptian dynasty here. Oh, there's one more. Sorry, I forgot. On the bottom, my thumb was covering it up. And the last one, who would have been the grandfather of David, was called Obed. And the equivalent pharaoh. And these pharaohs are more or less in order. I'm just reading them off the standard order that they come in for the 21st dynasty. The equivalent pharaoh would be Amenemopet. Obed, Opet. It's the same name. So essentially what we have here in the ancestors of King David is the 21st dynasty. It is the same dynasty. They are one and the same. Which was quite astounding, really. I mean, literally all I've done is changed a couple of consonants and missed out a few syllables, and you have exactly the same dynasty. And these consonant shifts happen all the time when going from Egyptian to Hebrew to Aramaic. The D and the T are always confused. The B and the P are always confused. So when you go from Obed to Opet, it's the same name. So here we have the beginnings of a united 21st dynasty of Egypt, a united monarchy of Egypt. And so I decided to look further into this and look at the family of Susens himself, Pasiba Kahayanet. And they matched up as well. So we had... the first one was the daughter of King David. And within the Old Testament, the accounts are confused because you have two accounts. I don't know if anyone's read the history of Solomon and David, but you either get it within Kings or you get it within Chronicles. There are two parallel accounts of the united monarchy. And they have sometimes different names. And so we have this daughter who I have conflated from the two different accounts, who is called Makatamar. And she was one of the primary daughters of King David. And in the Egyptian record, the daughter of Susens was called Makara Mutemhat. Makatamar? Makara Mutemhat? It's the same name. It really is the same name. And then, who else do we have in this dynasty? Well, one of the primary characters within the story of the United Monarchy is the army commander, because the story of David and Solomon is a story of a civil war in a way between father and son, between David and Absalom, his son. So there's lots of stories about these battles. And the commander, who was the commander of King David, was a very famous character called Joab. And the army commander of Pasiba Kahayanet was called Joab and Jed. Joab and Joab. It's the same name. And finally, we come to the architect, because remember, the whole of this story, especially from the Masonic point of view, is about the Temple of Jerusalem, because that is the basis of Masonic history, Masonic legend. It's about the building of the Temple of Jerusalem, because that is why Masonry is all about architecture. It's about masonry. It's about construction. It's about the building of the Temple of Jerusalem, which was built by David and later on by King Solomon. And the architect who actually built it is the primary hero of masonry, which is a little bit strange in a way, but they put obviously a different emphasis on this story. So they don't take David or Solomon as being their hero. Their hero is the architect, and his name is Hiram Abif. And I've read a few stories about this from Masonic history and from the Hiram Key and various other people, and they keep saying that Hiram Abif cannot be found in the biblical record. But that's nonsense, of course, because no, they don't say that, actually. They said Hiram Abif does not appear in the Old Testament, which I found very strange, because it's quite obvious that he does. Because in the New Testament, the architect of King David is called Hiram is my father, which is a very strange name. And you've got to think, as soon as you read it, you think, this doesn't sound right. Hiram is my father, that's his name. But if you go back into the Aramaic and look at the original, his name is actually Hiram Abi, because Abi means father. So in Masonic legend, he's called Hiram-Abif, and in the Old Testament, he's called Hiram-Abi. So he does appear in the Old Testament, but he also appears within the historical record, because the architect of Pasiba Kahanet, the same pharaoh of Egypt, was called Heru-Matif. So we have Hiram-Abif, Heru-Matif. It's the same name, it's the same person. So just in the last, however long it is we've been talking here, 20 minutes or so, half an hour, we have discovered the whole of the United Monarchy. So the United Monarchy does exist. It is a real monarchy. So the account in the Tanakh was correct.
What about the wealth, the great wealth of Solomon? Is there any evidence of that linking up with your theories?
Well, yes, because this was one of the richest dynasties in the whole of Egypt. So, yes, they were wealthy. In fact, if you go to, because all of these pharaohs, these mummies, were discovered in 1939, just on the outbreak of war, which is possibly why it didn't get much coverage at the time. So the war was just starting, the Second World War was just starting in 1939 when they were discovered. And they were transferred into the Egyptian Museum, which is where they are now. But the mummies that they found, the sarcophagi, were every bit as rich and wonderfully constructed as the sarcophagi for Tutankhamun. Now, they're slightly different because they are silver, which is very rare in Egypt. In fact, I did read that silver was actually more expensive than gold. And they actually constructed two silver sarcophagi. So we have the sarcophagi for Pasiba Kahanet, which is a standard anthropomorphic sarcophagus in silver. And for his son, well, his was actually a Horus sarcophagus. So this was for Sheshonq, which should have been his son, was a solid silver sarcophagus made in the form of Horus, the hawk. So yes, this monarchy was every bit as rich as the 18th dynasty of Akhenaten and Tutankhamun. And the question has to be, where did they actually get this wealth from? And some of the rest of the artifacts within the tombs suggest that a lot of this wealth came from the south. It came from Thebes. Because things like the tombs, the actual outer sarcophagi, stone sarcophagi, were taken from the Valley of the Kings. So this monarchy was a new monarchy. It only started in the 21st dynasty, but already it had become very, very wealthy. So yes, we do have exactly what the Tanakh says. We have an extremely wealthy monarchy establishing itself in a place called Zoan, not Zion, but Zoan, who was influential enough that monarchs would come from across the region to see this new dynasty because they were so wealthy, they were so powerful. So effectively, everything that the books of Kings and Chronicles is saying is probably correct.
What about the tombs of King Solomon?
Well, they are in Tanis still. So, as I say, these were discovered in 1939. Now, they're not great cavern tombs like down in the Valley of the Kings, because these are built up in the Nile Delta, and the Nile Delta is simply sand. It's silts from the River Nile. So there is no rock there to actually build a tomb into. So what they've done is they've dug down into the sand and put in stones, very large stones, and just constructed a very rough, you might say, looking tomb, especially from the outside. The inside is all smoothed with plaster and so on, but these are not the big tombs of the Valley of the Kings. And in fact, all of Tanis was borrowed from elsewhere. And this was one of the mysteries about Tanis when it was first discovered, because they thought that this was Pyramesy, that this was Avaris, the very famous place where the Exodus first started, the great city of the Hyksos. And they thought it was also the great city of Ramesses II, because everything has Ramesses II written on it. Meriamun is scribbled on every single part of the stonework and the pillars and everything. They later discovered that all of this stonework had been taken from Avaris, which is probably about, I don't know what it is actually, about 100 kilometers further south. Avaris is down at Zagazig, which is sort of in the mid-delta region, whereas Tanis is more up by the coast, it's up by the Mediterranean. And all of this stonework had been taken from Avaris and transferred to Tanis. Now, archaeologists say that was done because the Nile Delta river that ran through that region, the branch of the Nile, silted up. Now, that might be true, but it also might be true that Tanis was a safer location for this dynasty, and so they took the stonework from Avaris because Avaris was not such a secure location to have a capital city. Because remember, this was a new dynasty that was re-establishing itself in the Delta and was having to secure its position militarily to actually stay in the Nile Delta. I have a suspicion that some of this stonework was taken just because Tanis was a more secure location. But what they were taking, of course, was the old city of Avaris, which is why it's all covered in hieroglyphs of Ramesses II, because that's where the Exodus went from. It was called Pyramesy during the Exodus. During the second Exodus, I should say, not the first one. And the stonework itself is not original for Ramesses II either, and I don't know why this is not highlighted more in the archaeology. They never seem to mention this very much. But if you look at the stonework, it is not of the era of Ramesses II. And we can tell this because when they've inscribed the cartouche of Ramesses II on the top of the pillar, it goes through the original stonework, sort of fluting and decoration on the top of the pillar. And there's no way in the world that a stonemason would make a nice decorated top, not exactly the capital, but the top of the pillar, and then put a cartouche in the middle of it. So it's quite obvious that these cartouches have been put onto the pillar in subsequent years. And these pillars are actually much more ancient than Ramesses II. And if you look at them, these are really finely cut pillars in granite, which is, of course, the hardest of the stones, that have come from the very early period of Egyptian history. Egypt is one of those strange places where the early stonework is better than the later stonework. You've only got to look at that from, the Great Pyramid, the Giza pyramids, the Dashur pyramids, where they were carving granite much more easily in the old dynasties than in the New Kingdom. And these are very, very finely carved and decorated pillars, I think, from the Old Kingdom. But they've been hijacked by Ramesses II, who was known as the Great Chiseler, who has just chiseled his name on everything. And anyway, those stones now, those great pillars are up in Tanis, and they form the temple there. And funnily enough, the temple also has the same name as the Temple of Jerusalem. This is because, and I'm not sure if we've talked about this before, but the Israelites came out of Egypt. They spent 400 years in Egypt, even at the admission of the biblical texts. So they would have spoken Egyptian. Joseph, him of the coat of many colors, was the prime minister of Egypt and the high priest of Heliopolis. Moses was a prince of Egypt, and he was their chief army commander, according to Josephus. You don't get those positions within society if you don't speak Egyptian. So it's quite obvious that the main language that the Israelites would have used in Egypt was Egyptian. And of course, I say that the Israelites were the Hyksos. We've been through that before. And in fact, Josephus Flavius says that the Israelites were the Hyksos. And of course, the language of the Hyksos was Egyptian.
Let me ask you this. This is a big interjection. Do you think this version of history that you're discussing here, do you think this would hurt the Israelis more or the Egyptians more? Modern day.
Good question, because what I'm saying here, and there's a lot of evidence to back it up, is that the homeland of the Israelites is the Nile Delta. It was the homeland of the Hyksos, and of course Josephus Flavius says that the Hyksos were the Israelites. They were one and the same people, and the Hyksos held the whole of the north of Egypt, including the Nile Delta. And they had a civil war with the Theban Egyptians down in the south. Well, exactly the same is happening here with the United Monarchy. The United Monarchy are holding the Nile Delta. That was their homeland. And they were having a civil war, and we'll talk about this later when we come on to the Queen of Sheba. They were having a civil war with the Theban Egyptians down in the south. And so, effectively, the capital city and the nation of the United Monarchy was based in the Nile Delta. So the Jewish homeland should be the Nile Delta, not Israel. They only went to Israel, in my view, after the they went on two occasions, because after the United Monarchy we had the divided monarchy. And of course, the Egyptians, the United Monarchy, I'm saying, the 21st dynasty, the 22nd dynasty, didn't own just the Nile Delta. They owned all of Israel and Judea as well. So they did own that location. It just wasn't the location of their capital city. Their capital city was down in Tanis. But they did rule all of Israel and Judea. And so after the United Monarchy, when we have the divided monarchy, half of that divided monarchy was actually then based in Israel and Judea. So that's when we get the first settlements of these people, the United Monarchy, in Israel and Judea. And the second settlement we get is after the Babylonian exile. So circa 600 BC, the Babylonians invade, and they invaded Judea, and they also, as it says in the historical record, they invaded North Egypt as well. And when they sacked Jerusalem, Zion, they weren't actually sacking Jerusalem, they were actually sacking Zoan, they were sacking Tanis. And anyway, wherever these exiles came from, all these exiles, these Jewish exiles, were taken into captivity in Babylon, which is the Babylonian exile. And of course, many of them stayed in Babylon. They never came back, which is why Iraq was pretty much Jewish until 1947. And they don't talk about that either. Iraq was run by the Jews until 1947. But after the establishment of Israel, after the Second World War in about the 1940s, the Muslims of Iraq evicted all of the Babylonian Jews, and all the Babylonian Jews had to go into exile to America or to Israel or wherever. And there was a substantial amount. There was about 500,000 or so of these Babylonian Jews were kicked out. And the last king of, the last exilarch, or the king of, the Jewish king of Iraq, still has a claim in at the UN for about $30 billion worth of lost assets when he was kicked out of Iraq in the 1960s. 1950s, not the 1960s. Anyway,
that would be a part of what they call Greater Israel, right?
Well, yes, because they had been taken to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar on the Babylonian exile, and a lot of them never came back. They were so successful in Babylon, why would they want to go back to Israel? And what I think happened is there were a number of these Jews came back from Babylon, but because the region was controlled by the Persians at that stage, they didn't allow them to go back to Egypt. So the returnees from Babylon went to modern Judea and Israel instead. And that's when we get the second establishment of the Jewish people in Judea and Israel. So we had the first one after the United Monarchy failed, and we had the divided monarchy, and the second load of immigrants came in from Babylon after the Babylonian exile, and they came into Judea and into Israel. And that's when we get the building of, as it were, the first temple of Jerusalem. But it wasn't a proper temple, it wasn't a rich temple. The first temple of Jerusalem was actually built in Tanis. And that temple has the same name because, as I was saying before, the Israelites spoke Egyptian. And so if you look at Hebrew, modern Hebrew, it is a daughter language of ancient Egyptian. And I've made my own dictionary, actually. It's got about 450 entries, I think it is, where all of these ancient Egyptian words are present in the Hebrew as well, with obviously the same meaning, pretty much the same pronunciation. And one of those is for the Temple of Jerusalem. So the Temple of Jerusalem in the Tanakh is called the Haikal Yahweh, the Temple of Yahweh. And the temple at Tanis is called the Hetkar Ptah, the Temple of Ptah. And so the name for the temple is either the Haikal or the Hetkar. And you've got to remember that in Egyptian they didn't have an L. They missed out the L consonant for some reason. That only came later. And so when we translate from Egyptian into Aramaic, we often have to change the R into an L, which is what happened when these words were transferred into Aramaic. So then we get Haikal, which is the Aramaic, and Hetkal, which is the Egyptian. It's the same word. And we find this all the way through the Old Testament, because the Old Testament came out of Egypt, and not surprisingly, they spoke Egyptian. So most of the Old Testament can be translated from ancient Egyptian rather than translating it from Aramaic, which is what I attempted to do with my book Eden in Egypt, which was a translation of the book of Genesis, which of course is a very nebulous, difficult thing to understand. But it seemed to me that the book of Genesis was actually written in Egyptian, not in modern Hebrew or Aramaic. And most of the words are actually translatable in ancient Egyptian, which puts a little bit of a different spin on the Genesis story, and we can talk about that later if we've got time, perhaps. So, yeah, your question, who does this affect more? Does it affect modern Israel or modern Egypt? I think both have a lot to lose, because both have too much infrastructure in the regions they're in and don't want to change from one to the other. It would be very difficult. So, you'd have Israel staking a claim on northern Egypt. and Egypt having no claim, as it were, to the Nile Delta prior to, I don't know when you could say, prior to, I suppose, the Arab invasion of the 6th century, 7th century AD, when the Muslim invasions came along. Because, of course, the Egyptians are not Arabs. All of the Arabs that you see in Egypt today and the Arabic language you see in Egypt today is all in a recent result of the Arab invasion of Egypt, which didn't happen until about the 7th and the 8th centuries AD. So that's all a very recent change. The same happens with the Palestinians. You get all these stories about the Palestinians, but they're not Palestinians. They're Arabs. The Palestinians were the Peleset, and the Peleset came from Greece. They came from Macedonia. Nothing to do with the modern Palestinians at all. So the original Palestinians were the Peleset, who became the Philistines. That's what they called in the biblical text, of course. And they came from Greece. And it wasn't until, again, the 7th century, 8th century, that they were all wiped out by the Arab invasion, the Muslim invasions. And the Muslims not only took their lands, but they stole their name as well. So the modern newcomers to that region are not Palestinian at all. They're Arab. So we get a lot of these changes of names and lots of changes of nationality within these locations.
So was King Solomon black?
No. Another mistranslation. They say the same about Queen of Sheba. We'll have to talk about her later as well. They say
and that was the issue, right?
Yeah. She was said to be dark but beautiful. I think that's in the Song of Songs, isn't it, from the Old Testament? If you look at your Old Testament, you probably won't find the Song of Songs because it was a bit too racy for the English translation, so they dropped it out. So most of the Bibles don't have it. So if you want to read the Song of Songs, which is actually a delightful love poem about Solomon's love for the Queen of Sheba, you have to go on the internet probably because it's probably not in your Bible. But yeah, she was said to be a dusky maiden. She was supposed to be the queen of the south, which people interpret as being a queen of Cush, Ethiopia. But she wasn't. This was an Egyptian story. And here we come into some of the cover-up that there has been, because they didn't want to admit this. I mean, we've already come across this one big cover-up, because the Jewish authorities don't want to admit that they are Egyptian. So they forget that Josephus Flavius has already said that they are the Hyksos pharaohs of Egypt. They forget about that completely and pretend that they were just slaves in Egypt at the mercy of these terrible pharaohs, and they don't admit to them having a civil war and being Egyptian themselves. And here we have the same again with the United Monarchy. They don't want to admit that they were living in Egypt and that one of their kings, their most famous kings, was an Egyptian king, because it changes the story too much. Suddenly, you will find that Pasibeka-Hayenit, who is King David, was a polytheist. He wasn't a monotheist. Monotheism came from Pharaoh Akhenaten. And he had a big following, and he probably still had a big following even in the 10th century BC. But Pasibeka-Hayenit certainly wasn't a monotheist. And so they would have to admit that their Judaism, which they try and portray as being static, everlasting, only belonging to the Jews, nothing to do with anybody else, always been monotheist, is nothing of the sort. And in fact, it's nothing of the sort, even if you read Chronicles and Kings, because the United Monarchy of King David was far from being monotheist. King David and King Solomon built temples to many gods. It says so in the Tanakh. And they had temple prostitutes and so on. There was always later kings trying to clear out the temple prostitutes and things of this nature. It was far from the iconoclastic monotheistic religion that we see today. Very, very far from that. But they don't want to admit that. And so they don't want to, even if you showed, a letter from King David, Pasiba Kahanet, saying, this is us, this is me, this is the United Monarchy, here we are, they would still deny it. Because it conflicts too much with the story that they've created and fed down the generations to all the new generations. So they've got to deny it. And this is another area of what they deny. They haven't actually covered it up. It's all there if you read it. But gosh, you've got to really read the text hard and look at them to find the truth behind the normal explanations, because a lot of it's been hidden. One of the first ones I came across is that Uriah is Absalom. That probably needs some explanation. Absalom was the son of King David. And Uriah was the army commander that King David killed so he could steal his wife. Well, he didn't kill him. He put him in the front row of the army, so he got killed on purpose, so he could steal his wife. And his wife was Bathsheba. But if you read all these texts, because King David also had a battle with his own son, because his son led a rebellion against King David. And so they had this family squabble. They had this civil war between the son and the father. And in the end, King David killed his son, Absalom, just as he killed Uriah. And if you look at the text, it's quite obvious that Uriah and Absalom are the same person. And that changes things a little bit, because the wife of Uriah was Bathsheba, who eventually married King David. And now we begin to understand why she was called Bathsheba and who she was. Because if we go, and this is what I like about these explorations that I've done, is they start making sense of areas of the Tanakh which made no sense whatsoever at all before you put it back into its correct contexts. So why was she called Bathsheba? Well, the name of this king, King David, in the Egyptian was Pasiba Kahayanit. My star rises in my city, which can also be, because you can change the Siba into Duat, it can also be Paduat Kahayanit. And Duat is the Aramaic for King David. So they have the same name as well. But anyway, if we go back into the way it's spelt in most of the history books, which is Pasiba Kahayanit, if you take out that Siba, it is Sheba, Pasiba Kahayanit. And it means a star. So he was the star, my star in my city. And now if we go back to Bathsheba, we can see why she was called Bathsheba. Bathsheba means daughter of Sheba. And the Pharaoh was called Pa-Sheba. So she was the daughter of the Pharaoh. Now we begin to see the relationship. What they were doing by this, by slightly bastardizing the transcript by using the word Duat instead of the word Sheba, is they were divorcing King David from the rest of his family, from his daughter. Why? Because he married his daughter. So his daughter was Bathsheba, daughter of Sheba. His name was Sheba, King Sheba. And King David, King Sheba, married Bathsheba. He married the daughter of Sheba. Now, when he married her, she became the queen. And the queen in Aramaic is Malka Sheba, the Queen of Sheba. Now we've found who the Queen of Sheba was. The Queen of Sheba was Bathsheba. But they didn't want to admit that because it's too difficult, because it means that King David has just married his son. Sorry, I said that wrong, didn't I? King David has just married his daughter, who was Bathsheba. So you can see that they didn't really change the story. All they've done is change the name of King David from King Sheba to King David, King Duad. And suddenly you can't see all of the family links. You can't see that they went according to the normal royal law of incest. All of the pharaohs of Egypt always married a sister or a daughter to keep the bloodline pure. The same as Pharaoh Akhenaten did exactly the same. He married two of his daughters. And King David has done exactly the same. He's married one of his daughters, Bathsheba, who is the Queen of Sheba. But of course now this changes the story, because suddenly Queen of Sheba is not this dusky maiden from the south. She is called the Queen of the South because her power base, probably through her mother, was in the south. It was in Thebes. So this was a diplomatic marriage, the same as we see again later with King Solomon. And what appears to have happened is that King David initially married a southern princess. She would have been the mother of Bathsheba. So he married a southern princess whose ancestry was from Thebes. She was a southerner. So while they were having this civil war between the north and the south, his wife was actually a southerner. And so she was a queen of the south. And her daughter, Bathsheba, was also a queen of the south, because that was her heritage. And that's why the Queen of Sheba, Malka Sheba, the Queen of Sheba, was also called a queen of the south. It didn't mean she came from Ethiopia or Kush or wherever. It meant she came from southern Egypt.
Now, virtually all modern scholars agree that Sheba was the South Arabian kingdom of Saba.
Yeah, but it wasn't, because that is an interesting topic. We're sort of getting slightly ahead of ourselves, but yeah, let's go into that, because what they've done is made a huge assumption, because the city of Saba is connected with the Queen of Sheba, because their patron deity was the Queen of Sheba. And so they've said, okay, well, she must have come from that region. But in the archaeology from that region, and unfortunately we can't do any archaeology now because they're still fighting there now. This is Yemen, basically, where they're having the big war at present, and they've been having the large war since the last 50 years or so. But anyway, Saudi Arabia is now bombing the place, so it's still hugely unstable. But anyway, some archaeology was done in that region in the sort of 1950s and 60s. And it's a very interesting place. Got a rich, rich heritage, a rich Judaic heritage, dare I say. But it doesn't go back beyond about the 6th century BC. So it doesn't reach back as far as this era, the era of the Queen of Sheba. It doesn't go back that far, and yet they've leapt over the sort of missing 300 years and says, oh yeah, well, she must have come from Saba. She didn't. What happened, and we have this again from the Tanakh. This is why the Tanakh is actually a very good history book, if we can understand what it's talking about. What happened is that she became deified. She was such a famous queen. Don't let us forget her marriage to Solomon and all the rest of it, because that's interesting as well. She was such a famous queen that she became deified. And her name was Malka Sheba, the Queen of Sheba, the Queen of the Stars. And it's quite obvious from that name that she was Isis. So even in her original title, she was being called Isis, the Queen of the Stars. And she was deified. She became very famous. And in later years, the Jews of Israel were venerating the Queen of the Heaven. So again, we see that original Judaism was not monotheistic whatsoever. They were actually worshipping the Queen of Heaven. And of course, the Queen of Heaven is Isis, the Queen of Sheba.
And of course, you've got the Star of David. Is that any relation to that?
Oh, absolutely. Because the Star of David is Pasiba Kahayanit. My star is my city. My star in my city. And yes, he was identified with the six-pointed star in the same way that Isis was. The star of Isis is a six-pointed star. It's the Magan star. It's two pyramids superimposed. So if you get two pyramids and superimpose them, you get the six-pointed Star of David. The symbol of Israel is two pyramids. It comes straight from Giza, of course. These are the Giza pyramids. And the star of Isis was the same. So she was the queen of the pyramids. She was also the queen of heaven. And this is where the Jews got their queen of heaven from, that they were worshipping in the 7th century BC. They were still worshipping the queen of heaven. And then Nebuchadnezzar comes along, this is circa like 600 BC, and trashes Jerusalem. And the whole city, the temple is burnt and all the rest of it, and it becomes a Persian city, as it were. But they had a rebellion against the Persian governor, and they killed the Persian governor and killed the garrison. And then someone thought, well, perhaps this is not a good idea, because there is a huge Persian army coming our way. He's going to trash Jerusalem again. So they escaped. And so by night, there was, a large part of the Judaic army and the royalty and the administration left the city overnight. And they went down to Egypt. And this is the story of Jeremiah, the mad priest Jeremiah. He is a Jeremiah. Everything is doom and gloom, for Jeremiah. And all the way down this trip, he's saying that God will destroy you because you haven't honored God, and that's why Jerusalem is destroyed and all the rest of it. But anyway, one of the things he keeps on about is all of this happened because you are worshipping the Queen of Heaven, Isis, the Queen of Sheba, the Queen of the Stars. So these people who go out of Jerusalem, obviously Jews, these are, the Jewish monarchy going out of Jerusalem into Egypt, were worshipping the Queen of Sheba, the deified Queen of Sheba, Malka Sheba. And where did they go to? Well, it says in Jeremiah that they went to Egypt, first of all. They stayed somewhere north of Heliopolis in the Nile Delta. And I think they stayed at Yehudia, which is the city of the Jews. That's its modern name in Egypt, the city of the Jews, just north of Heliopolis, where they built a temple of Jerusalem. They built a Temple Mount, but a very small one, of course. And they lived there for a while. But I think afterwards, if you read this text, they were then, because Jeremiah was saying, God will come and destroy you, and I'm going to make him come and destroy you. You're not allowed to live in Egypt, and all of this sort of business. They got fed up with this. And if you read the text, I'm pretty sure they went to Saba. So they would have already had good links with Saba, because Saba was the incense growing area where they would have got their incense for the Temple of Jerusalem. So they probably knew about that place already. And I think these exiles, these Jewish exiles, went to Saba. And that is why Saba is called Saba. It's called Sheba, because they came out of Jerusalem. This is in the 7th century, 6th century. They came out of Jerusalem and went to Yemen, which is called Saba. And there they set up a new sort of principality, a new micronation based in that region because they had better technology than anyone there. So it was quite easy for them to dominate the local population in that region. who would have just been sort of like, local nomads and so on, because they had the technology, they had the infrastructure, they had the weaponry, they had everything. And they set up a micronation down in Saba. And one of the great constructions they made, of course, was the great Marib Dam, which they built there, which is a huge, great, vast dam to keep the winter rains over the summer period, so they could grow all of these spices. And they became very famous and quite rich for growing spices. And that's a bit of a misnomer, really, because a lot of the spices they were growing were hemp. And as you probably know, that's not really known for its aromatic qualities.
Well, it is actually.
Well, it's sort of aromatic, yeah, but it's more for its hallucinogenic effects, I think, because hemp became very big in the Roman Empire, and it became so big in the Roman Empire that eventually the Romans came down and trashed the place because Rome was being undermined by all of the hemp that was being grown in Saba. So they came down and took the place over. But anyway, that is where Saba came from. So the Queen of Sheba didn't come from Saba. The Queen of Sheba went to Saba. And she went there in deified form 300-400 years later. And they took her there as a deified form of Isis. And that's why their temples are called the Temple of the Queen of Sheba, the Temple of Saba. And what they built there, strangely enough, was a circular temple. And I think they got this from Egypt, because I write about this in some of my other books. This is where all my books start to tie in together. That one of the ancient traditions of Egypt was circling the pyramids. And they circled the pyramids, the masses of the people circled around the pyramids. This would have been the pyramids of Dashur, where it's free and open and you can actually go around the pyramids. Because they knew the pyramids were like the axis of the universe, because the Dashur pyramids, I said a long, long time ago, represented the axis of the universe, the celestial pole of the earth, where all of the stars rotate around the celestial pole. And so all the people rotating around the celestial pole are stars. So they're reenacting the motion of the planets, of the stars around the earth. That's what this ceremony was all about. And if you go to Saba, that's exactly what they were doing in Saba. So they made this great circular, open circular temple where all the people could walk around the central position, whatever was in the center. Now, when Saba failed, Saba had a problem. It was dependent upon the Marib Dam. And the Marib Dam broke in 610 AD. And so they lost all of their agriculture. The whole place fell apart. And so in 610 AD, we had all of these Sabaeans, which is where we get the word Sabaean from, the Sabaean worshippers, the star worshipper, because that's what Sabaean means. Sabaean means the star worshipper. It comes from the Egyptian word Saba, which means star. So we're going back into Egypt again. All of these Sabaeans were then exiled because their nation had failed up into Arabia in 610 AD. And who was waiting there to greet them? Well, that was Muhammad. Well, actually, it would have been slightly later. It would have been about 630 by the time they got up there. So who was waiting there? It was Muhammad. And he writes about this in his Quran, that the Sabaeans came out of Yemen while he was obviously in a place of influence. And he greeted them and he gave them shelter. But then they stole something, so he killed them all instead, as he always did. Remember, Muhammad was a warlord warlord. He wasn't a priest, he was a warlord. And so if in doubt, he always killed everybody. But all of these Sabaeans coming out of Saba would have been Jewish, of course, because they had come from Judea in the first place. Okay, they'd been separated from Judaism for 400 years, but they still had Jewish texts, and they were still have had Jewish rites and Jewish traditions. And this is where Muhammad got his version of the Quran from, because the Quran is a copy of the Tanakh, the Old Testament. But it's a bastardized and garbled version of the Jewish Old Testament. And I think this is why he got a different version, which puts a different emphasis on slightly different aspects of Judaic history, because he got the Old Testament from Saba, and not necessarily the one that the Jews had in Iraq, in Babylon.
So, we've all heard of ISIS, the terrorist group. Is that possibly their version of Make America Great Again? ISIS, a return to this star culture?
No, because they're following the Quran, and the Quran is a horrible text. It is the most hate-filled, barbaric text ever to have been written in the history of man. It really is. It has nothing really to do with the Old Testament culture or the Old Testament texts, apart from having, a few of the ancient heroes there, like Abraham and Moses and Jacob and people like that. It is a text that reflects who Muhammad was, because Muhammad was a warlord, and he was trying to control his warriors. And so the text he wrote reflects that. And so it's all about control of the infidels, and the infidels are anyone who is not Muslim. And it gives non-Muslims three choices. You either become Muslim, or you become a dhimmi, which is a second-class citizen, and pay the jizya, which is the protection money, or you die. And so what he set up was a protection racket, exactly the same as Al Capone did in Chicago. And that's why we get all of the violence we have today. If you don't do what they say, if you dare criticize them, you get killed, which is exactly what Al Capone would do in Chicago. And it's based on exactly the same principles, that to control a population, you take them over and you threaten them. And if they dare say anything against you, you kill them, because that keeps them in fear. And that's what a protection racket is. That's what a protection racket does. So that is the basis of ISIS, because they keep saying ISIS has nothing to do with Islam. But everything they have done in Syria and Iraq has come straight from the Quran. So all of the crucifixions, the amputations, all of the burnings where they set people alight, all of those things come out of the Quran. So, burning the pilot, and they've burnt another 2 or 3 recently, that comes from the verse that says, garments of fire have been provided for the unbelievers. So you've got an unbeliever here, and you give them garments of fire. You pour petrol on them, and you set them alight. So all of these acts of barbarity and evil come straight out of the Quran. That's what the Quran says. So these are the most pious and devoted Muslims in the whole of Islam. These are straight out of Wahhabi Islam from Saudi Arabia. They are following the true word of Muhammad. And that's why they are doing everything they are actually doing there, because that's what he said. This is how you control people. You take over the area and you threaten them. And if they don't pay the jizya tax, if they don't step into the street when a Muslim comes along, then you kill them. And that's what the Quran says. So, ISIS, nothing to do with America, America wasn't even invented when ISIS first started. ISIS is the personification of the old caliphate. That's what they're following, the ancient caliphate of Islam. So this is the war in Syria is a war that has been going on for the last 1,200 years.
I know we have so much more to talk about, Ralph. We're just out of time today. For the audience, they can pick up the book Solomon, Pharaoh of Egypt, The Tombs of King Solomon, and the Queen of Sheba Discovered. Of course, you can learn more about Ralph Ellis on his website, edfu-books.com. Ralph, would you like to carry on again next week? You can come back on the show.
Yeah, that sounds like a good idea. We've got a lot to discuss. We can finish off this, and we can also take maybe some listener questions about the New Testament as well. That would be fun. Yeah,
our classic interview, Jesus King of Edessa. What does that have? 1,000 comments or more?
Yes, it's going well. It's going well. So yes, we could have some interesting questions from the floor and see what people think about that.
And then one of the guests that's on the show quite a bit, Greg Felton, has challenged you to a debate. We're not exactly sure what the subject will be, but would you accept that challenge?
Yes, that would be a good idea. Let's get some of the opposite opinions and let's have a discussion on this and see where that goes. That would be fun. To keep the listeners happy. I'm sure they'll be amused by it, yes.
The audience can look forward to that. Ralph, good having you back on the show, man. It's been a long time. It's been over a year.
Has it? God, doesn't time fly? Yeah. Oh, yes. Then I hadn't told you that I've just written a science paper on paleoclimatology, so perhaps we can talk about that someday as well.
There you go. So lots more on the horizon from Ralph Ellis.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for being on the program.
Thanks, Russell.